You know, it goes beyond just simply misplacing your keys. Every 67 seconds, someone develops Alzheimer's. It's a diagnosis affecting 70,000 Kentuckians, and it affects the entire family, not just the patient. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we take an up-close look at Alzheimer's, coming up on Outlook. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us for this public affairs program as we're going to take a little bit closer look at Alzheimer's. You know, it's the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S., and sadly, less than half of the seniors with the disease or their caregivers are even aware of the diagnosis. Well, not only does it present an issue for the patient themselves, but what about the caregivers and what about their finances? We're going to take a closer look at that as we welcome to the program two individuals in the know, in the trenches. Welcome, if you will, Dr. Amy Krull, who is with WKU's Sociology Department. Amy also focuses and did her PhD thesis on these issues, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I said thesis, research. In addition, we are joined by I made you doctor, yeah. Stan Markham, who is a financial consultant. He does financial services. He's going to talk to us a little bit about how this devastates someone's income along the way. So before we get started, there was a man, Dr. Alzheimer, who this disease is named for. Do you know more about that?
Certainly he was working, certainly in the past, and was noticing these signs of dementia occurring in individuals, and was able to solve that it was a disease in the brain.
You know, we talk about dementia. You threw out that word dementia, and what I think it's important, while we want to make sure that people know you're a PhD, you're not a medical doctor, that often the diagnosis is dementia before it becomes full-fledged Alzheimer's. And an individual can live their whole life with dementia and it never go into full-blown Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. Help us understand that.
Well, and I think that that's a good distinction. Dementia is kind of like an umbrella term. It's a symptom, really, that refers to problems with the brain, maybe memory, maybe word retrieval, maybe problems, solving problems. And so that is really a symptom, and there are a lot of things that can cause that symptom. It might be something such as a nutritional deficiency or what we're talking about today, Alzheimer's disease.
And you deal with individuals in the insurance and the financial end of things, and people who are looking at long-term care for a loved one. Now, you've been in the business a little while. You've probably seen a transition as we're learning more about Alzheimer's along the way.
In my industry of long-term care insurance, I've watched Alzheimer's go from number 8 as far as the number of claims that were ever sent in, all the way to number 1. Out of the last 10 claims that I've had from my customers, 8 of them have been for Alzheimer's. So it's definitely on the increase.
So I guess the big question is diagnosis. You know, I said it goes beyond simply, I can't seem to find my keys. I keep misplacing my keys. I call that information overload. Too many other things on my mind, okay? But at what point, in your opinion and from your experience, should an individual decide that, you know what, this is going, you know, mom's being a lot more forgetful than she used to be. I'm being a lot more, you know, at what point do you seek treatment or a diagnosis?
Mm-hmm. The best way I ever heard it reported was from somebody from the Alzheimer's Association, and she says, if you forget, but you remember that you forgot, you're probably okay. So we all walk into the kitchen forgetting why it is that we walked into the kitchen, but we can recollect at a later point in time. With somebody who has dementia, they don't remember what it is that they forgot, and that forgetting becomes disruptive to their daily life, to their ability to do those things that we all need to do to live our lives.
So you're saying something like, oh yes, I turned on the stove, and walk away and totally forget that the stove is on, and then the house catches fire.
Right.
Those kinds of things.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And even changes, not necessarily with memory, but one's ability to solve problems that used to be easy. So for example, you've driven across the entire United States and you find yourself on a road trip and you can't manage those exits any longer. So that's a new problem that we wouldn't expect you to have, or perhaps language. um, retrieving that word that describes what it is that you are trying to speak about.
Now, we talked about for your PhD, you researched this, you were fascinated by this. Talk a little bit more about why that was.
Well, I was, as our society ages, I noticed some changes that were happening in our society. I also noticed that my parents were going through some changes in their lives, caregiving for their older parents. And so that's what really got me interested, is what happens to these caregivers and what is it that they're going through. And caregiving for Alzheimer's disease is very significant amount of work, or it can be a significant amount of work. And so I wanted to study what that work was like.
Well, speaking of that work, and again, we don't have a medical, but they're doing some amazing research on the brain and specifically on Alzheimer's. And they're doing this research at the University of Kentucky, after all. And what they're finding is that there's a protein that's found in people who have diabetes that's very similar to what they're finding in people who have Alzheimer's, and they're looking at treatment there. So what you're saying, and the reference that you made to someone who decided that, you know, if you forget and you keep forgetting, but you don't remember that you forgot, that sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? Then maybe it's time to seek help from a neurologist. Is that where people go?
Unfortunately, there's no single test that says this is Alzheimer's disease until one would do an autopsy after death. And so what our physicians have to do is kind of be investigators, and they'll do a general health examination. They might send you to a neurologist for brain scans, but really a diagnosis of Alzheimer's is one of elimination. Let's make sure that it's not a thyroid, that it's not a nutritional deficiency.
Are we finding a genetic link?
There are two genes that seem linked to Alzheimer's disease, and some of them, one of them is directional, meaning it's kind of heritable and it seems like it is directly linked to Alzheimer's disease. The other one is more of an indicator of the likelihood of the development of Alzheimer's disease.
One of the things that really shocked me, I went to one of the Alzheimer's workshops, and they showed the x-ray of a brain of a normal person, and then they showed the brain of a person who had Alzheimer's for 8 years, and they did an autopsy, and the brain had shrunk almost by half. I mean, that's the first visible sign that I'd ever seen about what happens to the brain with Alzheimer's. That was amazing to me, sad.
Very sad. And what's even sadder is that we don't know what causes Alzheimer's. You know, for years they talked about, well, and it used to be senility. They would just, you know, chalk it off to, guess what, so-and-so's just getting senile, they can't remember. And then there was a point at which, no, it's a little more serious than that. Caused by Teflon pans, by Teflon cooking pans. You know, who knows? Are we a little more sophisticated in the way we broach Alzheimer's now?
A little bit more, and there's been a lot of work and research eliminating these common myths that exist through the 80s and 90s and probably are still around today a little bit. But we know that there is nothing that we can do to prevent it specifically, unlike our other top causes of death in the United States.
So it's not preventable. And as far as treatments and diagnosis, we talk about the amazing research that's being done, but certainly we are not at the place where we've eliminated Alzheimer's. So you work on the financial end, okay? You're dealing with caregivers of people who have Alzheimer's. It can be financially devastating to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Why?
It's usually a process. What happens? The person gets Alzheimer's, and maybe they can take care of themselves for a while, and then they start doing some things. Maybe they don't take their medicine or have trouble, as Dr. Krull said, directional driving, and so somebody has to be with them for a little while. Maybe spend the night. A lot of people wander at night with Alzheimer's, so all of a sudden somebody has to be with that person. Well, usually it starts out as a family member, and hopefully that family member has plenty of money and nothing else to do, but usually it's the son or daughter who already has a job, and so they have to cut back on their work. Maybe they can't take a promotion and move to another town. So that's one financial aspect of it. And then when it gets serious enough that maybe there has to be more care, 24-hour care, then of course we're going to full-time home care, assisted living, or to a nursing facility. And just in South Central Kentucky, a nursing facility now costs $70,000 to $80,000 each year.
$70,000 to $80,000 each year.
That's this year. It'll be a little bit more next year.
Mm-hmm.
So the average, Dr. Krull can probably help me on this. I think the average Alzheimer's experience is somewhere between 6 and 10 years. And so we're talking about $500,000 to $1 million that somebody has to pay.
Is that indeed 6 to 10 years?
Yeah, about 6 to 10 years is an average for an institutional stay.
For an institutional stay.
Yeah.
And give us the profile of an Alzheimer's patient. I have been around some, and it can go from polar extreme, very loving, very childlike, and then we have another profile that might be just extremely angry, extremely hateful.
Right, and you know, that is like many of our diseases, it affects each individual differently. And so one person might be in a very mild stage of Alzheimer's disease for a number of years, and some other health problem will end their life for them. And so in that case, that person may not need the institutional care, but then there's other individuals who might rapidly decline and might rapidly need intensive care. So it's very difficult to predict.
And what usually takes an Alzheimer's patient? Is it just the inability to take care of themselves and their body begins to shut down? How does that work?
Well, that's a kind of a tricky question, because we certainly say that people do die from Alzheimer's disease, but oftentimes it's another medical problem that is made worse by the Alzheimer's disease. So for example, not being able to swallow, for example, the brain deteriorating enough so the person can't swallow, or perhaps the individual is not becoming hydrated enough or not active enough, so they get infections or pneumonia.
I see, so there are other complications.
Yeah.
I think they lose appetite a lot of times also, don't they?
Yeah.
But, yes.
And probably just forget to eat if they don't have a
Yeah.
caregiver.
Certainly.
There's so much more to talk about. Imagine if that loved one, the mother who raised you, the father who you played baseball with, suddenly couldn't remember your name, didn't think you were related to them. It can get very ugly along the way. We're talking about Alzheimer's today, but there is hope, and there's a memory walk coming up which you can get involved with. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when Outlook continues right after this break. Stay with us, won't you? Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us. We're continuing our discussion now as we take a little bit closer look at Alzheimer's. Welcoming back to the program, we have Stan Markham, who's with Financial Services, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the long-term care for his clients and how it might affect you. In addition, Dr. Amy Krull joins us. She's with WKU's Sociology Department. And before we took the break, you know, Alzheimer's, you know, there's a lot to it. You certainly cannot get through it in a 27-minute program. And we don't have a medical doctor here to talk about these things, but we thought we'd broach it from a couple different avenues, from the caregiving standpoint. But for our audience, if you would, help us understand what we're talking about when we say Alzheimer's. You know, it's different than dementia.
That's right. So Alzheimer's is the diagnosis of a disease, one of the symptoms of which is dementia. That losing of the ability of the brain to solve problems, memory, speech, for example.
Okay. And before the break, we were talking about how devastating it can be, certainly the diagnosis, but more importantly, you know, when you think about it, the patient, they're not there, okay? It's not as we know. So it really has an impact on the caregivers and on the family. Talk a little bit about caregivers.
Caregivers of people who have Alzheimer's disease have a very difficult job. And I like to think about caregiving as a continuum. So I think many caregivers begin caregiving through that phone call at night. Is everything okay? Are you ready to go to bed? And that phone call again in the morning. Did you get up? Did you have a good night? So simply checking in and adding that as a responsibility to the caregiver's life if that caregiver doesn't happen to be living with the person who has Alzheimer's disease. But then it can go all the way to the other end, is 24-hour care for an individual who may not be able to eat, may not be able to dress, bathe themselves, or participate in their own care of their body.
And as we talked about, you know, this disease, there's no cure. We don't know what causes it. They're making progress. They're making strides. But it can have so much. It's like a continuum for sure. But you said it could be 6 to 10 years of institutional care is the average?
Yes, again, I attend the Alzheimer's Association workshops, and that's where I get my information. They always tell us that the first 2 years are denial,
Denial on whose part? On the caregiver's part?
On the caregiver, and also perhaps the husband or wife or even a child. Embarrassment comes in when the person who's beginning with Alzheimer's forgets the keys or does those type of things. And it's just hard to accept that that's what's happening.
So the patient themselves are embarrassed? Because they're like, oh, I keep forgetting things.
They would be, but I actually meant more the son or the daughter
son or
or the
daughter,
husband
okay.
or the wife who probably has this vibrant spouse who is just not as sharp as they used to be, and they just won't accept it. It's not like a physical illness
Where
that
you
might
can
show
see
up.
the person,
Yeah.
yes, just slowly deteriorating. But this is a deterioration of a different sort. So denial, it's not happening. This
Right.
isn't real.
Well, when we forget things, do you go right out and tell somebody that, or do you kind of keep that to yourself?
Absolutely,
And
to
I think
myself.
that's yeah.
So when this, when it gets, to these extremes, certainly that changes things. Okay, so we've got better ways to diagnose Alzheimer's now. The best way, you say, which is a horrible way, is after someone dies, it's very simple to do not simple, but it's simple to diagnose, yes, this person had Alzheimer's. So for a neurologist or a doctor to diagnose this, that's a bit of a challenge.
It can be a challenge, and it really does require both the patient, if the patient is able, as well as the caregivers to cooperate fully with the physician and keep records of what has been happening and when, and be able to provide a comprehensive medical record for the physician to kind of do his or her sleuthing about the problem. And so often it is the caregiver or the family member that notices that something is going on, and they will rationalize it, as Stan said. It's stress, everybody forgets, it's a difficult time in our lives, but early diagnosis is so important so that people can do the kind of planning that they need to do, like taking care of things with Stan.
So early diagnosis in the sense, not necessarily because we can have a greater cure for Alzheimer's. Early diagnosis is because if this thing is going to escalate and go downhill, you want to be prepared.
And Dr. Krull can probably answer this better than me, but there are medications that if you take them in time, they will not prevent Alzheimer's. But I kind of call it delaying or pushing out the worst parts of Alzheimer's a little bit, and the earlier you take those particular medicines, the better it will be. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, and that's why I'm a big firm believer of paying attention to those early symptoms and consulting with a physician so that you have time for those medications to work if they might work for you.
And then again, as if you're just joining us at the beginning of the program, we said, this goes definitely beyond, I can't seem to find my keys, where did I put my shoes? Help us understand once again what we're talking about here. It's a little bit more than that.
It certainly is. It's the kind of forgetting and problems interacting with your life that are disruptive to your life. So forgetting or correctly balancing your checkbook, we all might do occasionally. But realizing that you have thousands of dollars missing and can't account for it and can't remember where or why that money is gone, that's a sign that something is problematic.
Go ahead.
I had a customer, of course I don't end up talking to my customers, I talk to their children or their spouse, and this particular one was doing pretty well. They had a route to go to the bank, and it was 2 rights and 2 lefts or whatever. Well, this one day there was some road construction, and this person had to go left instead of right, and they ended up in Franklin, Kentucky, 30 miles away, and so that's when that particular customer son knew that it was serious. But it can be a real disruption in that manner.
To your life, and as we mentioned throughout this program, there's the point, and there are variations on a theme of Alzheimer's, if you will. There might be the childlike attitude, there might be the anger and the kind of ugly behavior, and the forgetting. The simple forgetting. When a loved one, your child, is there in front of you and you don't even remember their name, or you say, "You're not my child." I heard the most interesting thing the other day. They're doing a lot of research with impromptu, like doing impromptu stuff for the stage. You bring it into your life where, say you're my daughter, I'm your mom, I don't remember you. You just play along.
Yes.
Why is that important?
Well, the thing about Alzheimer's disease is that if their memory is not functioning properly, they really are living in the moment. They really are living in the right now. And that is what improv comedy is about, taking charge of the moment and going with whatever it is that happens. And that seems to be good for a caregiver, to be agile, to be responsive, to be caring, as opposed to trying to correct the person that has Alzheimer's or situate them in current reality. It seems to really work better just to go with it and play along with it. Provides more comfort for the care recipient, the person who has Alzheimer's, as well as the person caregiving.
For the caregiver, because imagine if every day, no, Mom, I am your daughter. I mean, it's just losing. It's a losing battle.
It is.
So just kind of improv and go, okay, who am I? And just sort of play along, and that has proven to be less stressful for the caregivers. Interesting, very interesting.
There are so many resources from the Alzheimer's Association, both in Kentucky and just nationally. And I'm sure there are people watching this show who are caregivers for their loved ones. Reach out. There are so many things to learn about how to take care of your loved one and how to take care of yourself. There's just lots of resources.
And you hit the nail on the head there, the take care of yourselves, because caregivers can get so inundated and so low. And you know, you've done a lot of research on this. To caregivers who might be watching this, whether it's Alzheimer's or some other disease, what's the most important thing you want to say to them?
Well, if you want to continue to give care, you have to be able to continue to give care. And you're not able to give care if you're not caregiving for yourself first. And so that's really important to do, but it's also very difficult to do when your attention is turned to somebody who's much more sick than what you may be feeling at that point in time. More in need, yes,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I like to send a message not only to caregivers to make sure that they're finding a way to restore their own self, but friends of caregivers. So often friends of caregivers will say, let me know if you need anything. And that's really difficult for a caregiver to identify something. But if a friend of a caregiver could say, I know you like to go to church. Can I watch your loved one while you go to church on Sunday? That's a much easier offer to accept on the part of the caregiver, and allows the caregiver to do something that might restore their energy.
So important. We say they're making great strides with Alzheimer's in the research and the diagnosis and in the, I don't know that a cure is on the horizon, but they are making strides. There are walks that they have throughout the country, and in particular there's one coming up, they call it the Memory Walk, which is appropriate, and that's going to be held in Warren County. When is that?
There are 12 different walks in the state of Kentucky, so I'm sure there's hundreds all over the United States. And this will be the 15th year that we've had our Walk to End Alzheimer's. It is September the 19th, and for the first time it's down at Circus Square across from Sky Pack.
In downtown
We're
Bowling
really
Green.
excited. It's always been at Preston Miller Park. It's not there this year. It's at Circus Square. And registration begins at 9. We have a really nice program at 9:30. The walk's at 10. You do not have to walk. It's nice just to come to it. But we raised almost $90,000 last year.
Well, congratulations.
We're shooting for $100,000 this time. And if anybody, you can just walk up that day and sign up. You don't even have to donate. Of course, we'll take donations. But just come down there that day, and we hope it's not raining.
September 19th. You know, something we didn't talk about, we've addressed the issue of seniors and Alzheimer's. We talked about senility, dementia, and I think there is a terrible profile or a terrible stereotype that so many of us do, assuming that if they have Alzheimer's, they have to be old. That is not the case anymore, is it?
That's right. And we call that either early onset or younger age onset of Alzheimer's disease. That is one of the genetic links that we see, is that if you have the early onset Alzheimer's, it is genetically linked, and you can kind of probably look at your family history and identify some of that.
And we're talking 30s.
Yeah, 30s, 40s, and 50s, whereas the typical Alzheimer's patient we would think of as somebody over the age of 65, and of course the older one gets, the higher your risk for developing Alzheimer's.
There you go. And then the 6 to 10 year period that someone could be having Alzheimer's.
And it can last longer sometimes, depending on if you're extremely healthy when that hits, you're more likely for it to last longer than if you already had some health problems. But I know one of the companies I represent, we have a 47-year-old with full Alzheimer's, 24-hour care, 47.
At 47
I
years
used to
old.
think that was old. I don't think that's old anymore.
Not anymore. We're talking about Alzheimer's, and we're going to put up, of course, a contact information if you want to find out more from the Alzheimer's organization. But we're just about out of time. Dr. Amy Krull with WKU's Sociology Department, leave us with some words of wisdom for caregivers in particular of patients with Alzheimer's.
If you are a caregiver of somebody who has Alzheimer's disease, find the resources in your community, whether it be through the Alzheimer's Association, through your medical facility, or your friends and family.
But care for yourself,
Care for yourself.
first and foremost, before you care for someone else. And from a financial standpoint and planning for the future, you know, it's not going to happen to me, they say, and then suddenly one day, guess what? It does. So what advice would you have for people in that regard?
Well, I didn't come here to sell anything, but obviously it's good for you to put aside some money, either your own money or to buy some kind of insurance protection, not only just for Alzheimer's, but any kind of long-term care illness that can devastate you financially.
Thank you. That's good
Okay.
advice. Stan Markham has joined us, Dr. Amy Krull. And again, you can contact the Alzheimers.org organization to find out more about Alzheimer's. And of course, you can participate in the Memory Walk, which is being held locally September 19th, Circus Square Park. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. Thanks so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And thank you for joining us. Until next time.